Wow. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Elizabeth Horner. I'm the Director of Education here at the Michael C. Carlos Museum, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you today to the annual Laszlo-Excalibur Lecture. The Laszlo-Excalibur Lecture was endowed in honor of Dr. John Laszlo by his friends and family upon his retirement from the American Cancer Association. And so every year, it enables us to bring phenomenal scholars, writers, and thinkers and artists who have relationship with the classical world. And so Dr. Laszlo and Pat, thank you so very much for making this happen year after year. It is always a highlight of our year. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce our curator of Greek and Roman art, Dr. Ruth Allen, whose extraordinary exhibition, Making an Impression, the Art and Craft of Ancient Engraved Gemstones, is our reason for being together today. So Ruth will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Good afternoon. It's great to see so many of you here at the museum, and welcome to those joining us via Zoom. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to start with Emory University's land acknowledgements. Emory University acknowledges the Muskogee Creek people who lived, worked, produced knowledge on, and nurtured the land where Emory's Oxford and Atlanta campuses are now located. In 1821, 15 years before Emory's founding, the Muskogee were forced to relinquish this land. We recognize the sustained oppression, land dispossession, and involuntary removals of the Muskogee and Cherokee peoples from Georgia and the Southeast. Emory seeks to honor the Muskogee Nation and other indigenous caretakers of this land by humbly seeking knowledge of their histories and committing to respectful stewardship of the land. So it is my pleasure to welcome to Atlanta Kenneth Lapatin, who is not only a celebrated classical scholar and curator, but a dear friend, colleague, and mentor, who has contributed vastly to my career, but we're not here to talk about me. It's sort of hard to pick out some highlights from Ken's career. He has published widely on the luxury arts of Greece and Rome. And as curator of antiquities at the Getty Museum in Los Angeles, a position he's held since 2002, he has curated a number of hugely important exhibitions, including Buried by Vesuvius, Treasures from the Villa dei Papyri at Herculaneum, Palmyra, Loss and Remembrance, Power and Pathos, bronze sculpture of the Hellenistic world, and many others. The reason that we've invited Ken to Atlanta today is because he has worked for many years on ancient engraved gemstones, Greek and Roman. And today is going to be talking to us about the people behind the stones, helping us think broadly, not only about the individuals that engraved these miniature artworks, but about the many people that contributed to the acquisition, production, working, and sale of these luxury goods. And is drawing important attention to many voices and individuals who aren't often given space in traditional art historical accounts of this minor in scale, but I think major in impact art form. So without much further ado, because you don't want to listen to me talking, Ken, the microphone is yours. Making an Impression, the people behind the stone.
Thank you, Ruth, for that generous introduction. And thank you for the invitation to you and Elizabeth and everyone at the Carlos. I'm particularly pleased to be here on the occasion of this fantastic exhibition, which I think might rightfully be called the largest exhibition of ancient gems, of tiny objects. And it's a real feat to display these objects in a public setting because they are so small and they were really meant to be handled and looked at up close. I also want to thank and acknowledge John Laszlo and Pat for their support of the programming here, and how honored I am to return to Emory for this talk. And thank you, Elizabeth, for doing, wherever you are, for all of the organization that and time you put into making this a reality. So when I say the people behind the stones, I don't mean any of these people that you see on the stones. I don't mean Apollonides, and I'm sorry for those of you where the captioning is overlaying the captions I put in, but this inscription, Apollo F, which we think probably means Apollonides, Felix Happy Apollonides, which may be the owner of the gem, maybe the person on the gem, the jockey of the horse. I don't even mean this woman from Herculaneum who died in the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in AD 79 that also buried Pompeii, who was wearing 2 rings with gems, one an intaglio and the other just an emerald. When I say intaglio, and most of the gems I'll be speaking about today are intaglios, it's a modern term from the Italian intagliare, same root as tagliatelle, to cut. It's a gem that's cut in. And most ancient gems were intaglios, and their original functions were seal stones. So they leave a relief impression, but they're intaglios. This is the opposite of cameos, which are carved in relief, usually of a banded stone to create coloristic effects, such as this wonderful portrait of an empress in the exhibition. You can see how the carver has not only exploited the 3 bands of this banded agate to create different colors, but even very thinly cut through that topmost brown layer to give a sense of blush to the cheeks and the neck of the figure. So this is almost painting in stone, but this is a cameo. However, my topic today, and we can talk about a little bit in the Q&A if you like, my topic today is not about technique. For that, you will soon have here my dear friend and someone who's been a mentor and educator to me, Master Gem Engraver Chavdar Chushev, who I believe will even have a residency here. So you're very lucky. So we can talk about technique, but that's not my topic. My topic is the people who made the gems, who handled them on their long journeys to the hands of the owners and the possessors, the people and us as viewers today. And we don't really have, that I'm aware, many depictions or any of ancient gem engravers. In ancient art, we have paintings of painters, such as this female painter of Pompeii. We have pots depicting potters. We have other images of blacksmiths, of glass blowers, and very famously of sculptors at work. Even gem engravers depicted people executing other crafts. Here, 2 sculptors, the gem on the left in the Metropolitan, the one on the right here in the exhibition. But of gem engravers, we don't see them. This scarab, Etruscan scarab on the left in the British Museum, has sometimes been identified as a gem engraver operating a bow drill. And if you look closely, you can see the tool. It's shown more clearly on this watercolor of an Egyptian carving using the bow to back and forth move the drill. But the figure on the left isn't necessarily a gem engraver, and it's more possibly a furniture maker. We do have some images from ancient Egypt, especially in the mastaba of Tiet Saqqara, which is labeled cutting a seal by a seal cutter. And you can see the figure seated, sort of operating what seems to be some kind of rotating hand drill. And from the tomb of Sobek-Hotep, we see it seems to be bead makers at work. They're operating bow drills with multiple drills to make beads. And in the lower right, it seems to be the beads. As far as engravers themselves, the earliest engraver known to me is Iliaknud, who presented this seal now in Chicago to the goddess Nin Ishkun. It doesn't depict Iliaknud or a gem engraver. It depicts the gods themselves. Nin Ishkun standing on the lion, approaching the goddess Ishtar from the late 3rd millennium. But if we want to know something about Greek and Roman gem engravers and gem working, and that is the topic I've been asked to speak on, we have to move much later and to somewhat less informative media. And basically, we have 3 sources. We have 2 written epigraphic evidence in the form of inscriptions on stones. We have literary evidence, and then we have the gems themselves. And I'll be working through this material. So this fragmentary and rather modest grave stone epitaph for Lucius Utidius Hermias tells us explicitly that Hermias was a gemarius sculptor, a sculptor, a carver of gems. And there are various names, words, I should say, for gem engravers, both in Greek and Latin. And gemarius is the most common, and that could mean, you know, person having to do with gems, but it's not necessarily a gem engraver. It could be a jeweler or even a merchant in gems. But Lucius Utidius Hermias, he's explicitly a carver of gems, a gemarius sculptor, and then we know that he lived to be 45 years old, annos fixit 45. So that tells us something about him, but not much. And this is a rather modest slab that would have been attached to a larger monument. Some people have suggested that Hermias was a freed slave. The inscription doesn't tell us that. We'll see that in other inscriptions. He has a good Roman tripartite name. And this is a slab of marble rather than limestone, but it's not a fancy grave relief. Giving us somewhat more information, and this is what we deal with as classical archaeologists, is a now lost gravestone that fortunately, before it was lost, what epigraphers call a squeeze was made. A wet paper was applied to the stone and pounded with a brush to make an impression of the tombstone, which you see that on the left. And this is the fragmentary gravestone of Doros of Sardis, who we were told was 18-year-old when he died. He's identified as a dactyliokoiloglyphos, an engraver of finger rings. And at the very top is a very important representation of a kind of bow-driven lathe. Again, Chavdar, we'll talk about that. And if you've seen the show, you've seen the wonderful video of Chavdar, who actually constructed his own horizontal lathe. We're also told that Doros was not only 18 years old, but that he was chaste, Parthenion. He hadn't yet experienced Aphrodite, and were given the names of his parents. We have some other epitaphs of gem engravers I'll talk about, and gem workers, one of them later. But this is the kind of abbreviated information, who they are, who their parents are, where they were from. Then we have the literary sources that do mention gem engravers by name, just as they mention ancient painters, ancient sculptors, ancient architects, ancient silversmiths. And I'm not going to go through each and every one of them that was named, but the Roman writer Apuleius in his Florida writes of Menisarchos of Samos, who lived in the 6th century BC, who was a skillful jeweler who excelled in the carving of gems, although he sought fame rather than wealth in exercising his art. we know very little more about Menisarchus of Samos. We don't know how much wealth he got. We don't know how much fame he got other than this one mention, although we do also know that his son was much more famous than he was. His son didn't follow him into the craft of gem engraving, however. His son was Pythagoras, the mathematician and geometer. And it's been, I think, rather cleverly suggested by our colleague Patrick Crowley that Pythagoras' useful experience with his father as a gem engraver might have something to do with his interest in planar geographies. These three gems in the exhibition are much later than the period of Pythagoras and Menisarchos. They're from the Roman period, but they give you a sense of how maybe witnessing the faceting of gems in his youth might have gotten Pythagoras thinking about the intersections of planes and planar geometry. Unprovable, but enticing. The most famous of all ancient gem engravers, according to ancient literary sources, is Pergopolis, who we are told by many ancient writers carved the image and the seal stone of Alexander the Great. He was one of three artists Alexander is said to have approved of the making of his portraits, the other two being somewhat better known, Lysippus of Sicyon and the painter Apelles. The gem on the left from the University of Pennsylvania is in the exhibition. It's not by Pergopolis, it's later in date, but it reflects what we know of Alexander's image, the big lock of hair coming out of his head, the bulging brow, the deep set eyes, the piercing glance. And the cameo on the right in Paris has been, in my view, optimistically, not impossibly, but optimistically, attributed to Pergopolis. But how do you attribute a work of art to an artist for whom you have nothing provable by that artist? It's a game of wishful thinking that collectors across the ages and curators to this day sometimes too willingly push their attributions to attach great names. This gem belonged to Louis XIV before it entered the French national collections and was given this later enameled surface. So if we want to know about gem engravers who have whose gems we have today, there's no better place than to start in the exhibition, where we have this fragmentary Cornelian intaglio inscribed with the second half, because of damage, of the name of Dioscorides, Dioscoridu. And these inscriptions, with one exception, all run retrograde, backwards, mirror writing, so that when they would be impressed in the clay or wax would read right side up. And this is a stunning gem, unfortunately broken, signed by Dioscorides, that shows the hero Bellerophon taming the horse Pegasus. And it's a scene that appears in other media. And here I show you a Pompeian wall painting where you really see the same composition, except here Athena or Minerva to the Romans is there helping the hero. But this gem, and again, those of you who have seen the show know it's a very, very small thing. I think it compares, despite its damaged condition, extremely favorably to the much larger painting if you take the time to really look closely. And that's one of the things gems really require of us, as they did of ancient viewers, that we take the time. We can't just glance at them and drink in and capture immediately what's going on. We have to look, and the more we look, the more we see, and the more we're rewarded. So if you look at the musculature of the hero, the chest, the ribs, they're more fully defined than on the much larger painting. If you look at the legs of the horse, the forelegs are similar, but the hind legs you can see are differentiated, and there's the tail. There are different angles. There's a sense of depth and foreshortening. This is very, very high quality carving. And if we look at other gems from Dioscorides that do survive, and we have several, we see this virtuosic work. This is an amethyst intaglio depicting the orator Demosthenes, recently acquired by my museum, I'm glad to say. It has been known since the early 1600s, but only recently entered a public collection. And you can see on the right, and I've transcribed for you, in minute letters, the name Dioscorides that was fragmentary on the Boston gem. And I have here a purple glass replica made for me by Chavdar Chushev, giving you a sense again of this actual scale of this thing. And here it's blown up, I don't know what, 200 times or something. And you can see the quality, the precision of the portrait of the orator, whom we can identify himself because we see his image in other media. We have it in bronzes, in marbles. Demosthenes lived in the 4th century BC. This was carved in the Roman period. And I could talk at length about the meaning of this gem in the Roman period, but that's not my topic. So we can return to that. Other gems that have survived, signed by Dioscorides, are this wonderful intaglio showing the Greek hero Diomedes sitting on an altar, having killed sacrilegiously either a temple guard or a priest, depending on which version you want, while he's snuck into Troy to steal the Palladion, the miniature statue of the goddess Athena, which he holds in his hand while the god Poseidon on the pillar in front of him turns his back away from him. This is, again, extraordinary carving, long in the collection of the dukes and duchesses of Devonshire, still at Chatsworth. And Dioscorides, like many carvers, worked both in intaglio and in cameo. On the right, another gem known since the Renaissance. We believe it's this gem that amazed Michelangelo, long in the collection of the Dukes of Brandenburg, now in Berlin, where the inscription is not carved retrograde. It's carved to be read on the stone because cameos occasionally were used as seals, but weren't designed for that. And we see the hero Hercules or Heracles wrestling with the hellhound Cerberus. Again, I'm showing you these things on the screen blown up, and blown up at this scale, you can really appreciate the detail. But holding them in your hand, rotating them in the light, I want you to think also of the tactile experience, especially of the cameo. Here you see in oblique angles that the owner, the possessor's fingers would have run over it, as would the carvers. Think of these other sensory impressions. The bling of the gems, their ability to glow, to radiate, to shine light, especially in a world before electricity gave them power. But also, I want you to think of this tactile experience. These things were worn on rings, on pendants, on the body. They had an intimate experience. You'd feel the smooth roundness of the cameos or the sharp edges of the intaglios. Other senses were involved too during the carving and the mining, touch, smell of the grinding away of the stones, even taste mattered. But that again is perhaps another talk. But what we're trying to do in this talk is to think about the lived experiences of the people who handled these gems, who made them for ancient owners, and ultimately, without knowing it, made them for us to enjoy. I've shown you so far extraordinarily fine gemstones, things from the top of the pyramid, the works of Dioscorides, the gem engraver, to the Emperor Augustus. In other fields, we don't have that. We have the names of Phidias, of Praxiteles, of Polygnotus, of Apelles, of Zeuxis, of Parrhasios, all these names given to us. But here we see the high end of production, but the same techniques and many of the same experiences were felt by those operating at other levels. And so here I show you Dioscorides' gem in Chatsworth again, with a more modest gem in Boston showing the same scene. And you have all of the elements, except you don't have the body of the fallen priest or warrior. And you can see how the forms are somewhat simplified. These gems were intrinsically valuable. The work of fine craftsmen gave them higher value, but they were available at shall we say, different price points to different people. And they were also available in glass. We also have in the exhibition a more modest scene of Diomedes using a different iconography. And one thing to point out is that in ancient art, as I've shown you, the head of Demosthenes, the intaglio of Demosthenes, the painting of Diomedes, the intaglio of Diomedes, there is a parallelism in these image types that operate across different media, and we can trace them, but there are variations such as a standing Diomedes versus a seated Diomedes, but the sword here implying the assassination of the priest. Now, we know a little bit more of Dioscorides, not from literary sources and not from his own gems, but from the gems of his sons who followed him in the craft. He had 3 sons who followed him in the craft, and this was not atypical, and even through the Renaissance and today is not atypical, although Chavdar Chushev is self-taught and his son is doing his social media and isn't engraving. But here we have 3 gems signed by Hylos, the son of Dioscorides, and this with tiny inscription. This gem is the size of my fingernail. It's tiny. These are not to scale, the 3 of them. This cameo actually has the verb epoie, so we know he's signing as the maker. Then we have Hierophilos on this turquoise glass cameo now in Vienna, which is about 3 times as large. It's about, I think, almost 6 centimeters. And then the longest gem inscription as a signature known to me by the 3rd son, Eutyches, the son of Dioscorides, who gives us additional information in this deeply cut, now sadly broken, intaglio in Berlin. It says, you see epoie made at the end, but there's this 4th word, Agiaios, from Agiai, a town in Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. So Eutyches tells us that he, and presumably the family, came from Turkey, but we know they ended up in Rome. They ended up working for the emperors. The turquoise intaglio is of Drusus Maior, otherwise known as Germanicus, the brother of the emperor Tiberius and the favorite of Augustus until he died. So, these, again, all from imperial workshops, but here, gem engraving, it's a very portable art. The tools are small, the gems are small, even that lathe is small, and gem engravers did and could travel. And it's often challenging for us to know where the engraver is operating because the gems also could travel after they were carved. But these imperial portraits, the one in the center, the lost seal stone of Augustus carved by Dioscorides, were certainly carved in Rome. And for a sense of quality, these are, again, like the works of the father, works of the highest quality, but this head of a satyr in intaglio in red jasper in the exhibition maybe doesn't quite reach the level of Hylos, but is a very fine gem itself, showing an older satyr who has more sallow cheeks. You can really understand the detail. He has a wreath, which Hylos's cameo doesn't have. Both of them have this very expressive pointy ear, folds of the neck, and both of them are wearing a fawn skin that's very expressively rendered. In the show, there is one gem from Boston signed by Hylos himself. So we have Dioscorides and Hylos in the show. Here, a marine family, a triton and a nereid with a dolphin and an eros. This marine imagery has important ideological and political meaning for the Romans under Augustus, having spread peace across both land and sea after years of civil war. And these gems by Dioscorides and his family have been praised for centuries. Here's one signed by Hylos that has been reinscribed on the right by Lorenzo de' Medici, who was a great connoisseur of gems, who valued his gems so much more highly than his paintings or anything else, the things that we admire today. This gem is quite interesting. It also inscribed, as you see in the upper right of the gem itself, you see a bronze impression on the left by Lorenzo. It doesn't have the signature of a carver. It came to be known in the Renaissance as the Sigillo di Nerone, the seal of Nero. Now, the seal of Nero actually would have been the gem carved by Dioscorides for Augustus that was passed down to all the Julio-Claudian emperors that's lost. This was called the seal of Nero because Nero featured Apollo playing the lyre on his coinage. And of course, Nero was famous for fiddling, playing a lyre while Rome burned. This is a different myth. You have Apollo playing the lyre, and behind him is the satyr Marsyas, who challenged him unsuccessfully to a music contest, playing the flutes, which are hanging from the tree behind him. Marsyas loses, gets tied to a tree and flayed. This gem, like so many others, has optimistically been attributed to a great carver. It's been attributed to Dioscorides, like the cameo in Paris. And I, as you might imagine, originally didn't really think this was plausible. But having the opportunity to look at these closely and hear good photography and good lighting helps. Oh, I forgot to show you Botticelli, who knew this gem and put it on a pendant around the neck of Simonetta Vespucci, although he changed Apollo's lyre to a bow. Anyway, when you compare the gem of Diomedes signed by Dioscorides, and we have all these Dio names, I'm sorry, with the so-called seal of Nero, and you look closely at the anatomy, especially of these seated figures in three quarters, the treatment of the ribs, the treatment of the abdomen, the treatment of the shoulders and the arm. This is an exercise in connoisseurship. But here, unlike with the gem in Paris, I have something by Dioscorides I can compare, and I can make an argument based on specific features that, yes, this may well have been carved by Dioscorides. And the Marsyas myth also has important implications for Roman history and Roman monuments, about which Eric Varner here knows a lot more than I do. So I think with Dioscorides, we and his family, we have remarkable preservation of works mentioned by ancient literary sources, if not the actual seal of Augustus. The other gem engraver, the only other one that I know of who tells us where he's from on his gems, you have seen before in this lecture series. Rachel Pat showed it to you, and I think it's one of everybody's favorites, carved 4 centuries earlier by Dexamenos of Chios. Dexamenos, a poie, signed with fewer letters, of Chios, made this beautiful blue chalcedony showing a heron or crane as if flying through the sky. And Dexamenos signed this in a style known as stoichidon, used in inscriptions of the Athenian classical period, where all the letters line up neatly in a row. You see that in this signature, as well as on this beautiful mottled jasper portrait of a bearded man. We don't know who this is, now in Boston, where the letters also line up. So we know Dexamenos was from Chios. His gems, a lot of them have been found in the Black Sea. We don't know if he went to work in the Black Sea or he had some relationship with the Black Sea and was shipping gems up there. Others have been found in Attica near Athens, like this one. This one signed by Dexamenos in the lower right of the gem, and also inscribed, it seems, with the owner's name, Mike. It says of Mike, Mikes, in the upper right, of a woman with a slave or servant girl bringing a mirror to her, the kind of imagery we see very often on Athenian grave monuments. The mirror in the Middle Ages and Renaissance comes to signify vanity, but in antiquity, it signifies beauty. It has a positive value. Dexamenos liked to carve these clear, smoky, grayish blue chalcedonies, and also these mottled jaspers. Again, on the left, a sign gem, fragmentary, but saying Dexamenos, where the crane is turning its back and about to paw a grasshopper. And then the gem on the right, again, I think pretty reasonably attributed to him without the signature. We, in the same purchase of a private Swiss collection, Monte Carlo collection, just before the pandemic, acquired this grasshopper on a mottled jasper that we, I think, reasonably attribute to Dexamenos or his workshop. Now, I could go for an hour or two or three showing you signed gems. And recently I did some tabulations, and I don't expect you to absorb all this, but we have 83 names plausibly of gem engravers who signed their own gems. That is, I believe, more than we have of Athenian vase painters who signed their own gems on 149 stones. Sometimes they use, for those of you who know your ancient languages, sometimes they're in the nominative, meaning the case of the subject, sometimes they're in the genitive, meaning of somebody, and there are changes across time. Almost all of these inscriptions, except on cameos, are retrograde. The only ones that aren't are the signatures of Dexamenos, which raises interesting questions. Was Dexamenos carving for people who weren't really using the gems as seals and didn't care, because they're meant to be read on the stones rather than read in relief? And there's more information here that I won't bore you with. But before leaving the engravers to look at other people, I want to push a little further just to think about their names. This gem in Paris, and it's very hard, I realize, to see the inscription, which is here, and you can't read it because of the captioning, is inscribed Daedalus. Daedalus is the famous mythical craftsman, right? The one who built the maze for King Minos, the great inventor. So here you have an engraver who takes a mythological name, which carries claims of skill and craft and ingenuity on this wonderful portrait. We also have carvers who took the names of other artists. The one on the left, the painter Apelles, and the one on the right, the sculptor Phidias, the most famous sculptor from classical antiquity. So these are carvers who have taken noms de plume, as it were, who, again, by choosing these names, are asserting something about their skill and the status of their craft. With Phidias, it's especially poignant, I think, because Phidias was most famous for his massive, monumental gold and ivory temple statues, statues that stood or sat some 40 feet tall. And we have two images on gems in the show of two of the most famous Phidian statues, the Athena Parthenos or Zeus Olympius. These gems were not carved by Phidias or Apelles. You know, they were talented, but they didn't have command of all these different arts. But they're the carvers making claims about their status. And we also learn other things from the names. From the late Hellenistic and Roman period, we have all these signatures. They're carved in Greek letters, but some of them are Latin names, like these two, Gnaeus and Gaius. The one Gaius on the right cleverly puts his signature inscription as if on the collar of the dog star of this garnet. But these are Roman names. We don't know the ethnicity of the carvers themselves, but they're signing in Greek because, as my dear late colleague Miranda Marvin once said, Greek is the language of the muses. This is the language of high status. And we even see this problem with ethnicity on these two, both fragmentary gems, the cameo signed by Alexis, Alexa in the genitive, of or by Alexa, and carving the letters in relief in a cameo is an awful lot of work. You saw how Dioscorides just incised it. His inscription, his signature was an intaglio rather than in cameo, but Alexa signs in cameo. And then the fragmentary gem on the right is signed by Quintas, which is Greek letters for Quintus, a very solid Roman name, but he's the son of Alexis. So you have a Greek carver who names his son Quintus. So we see this exchange between the Greeks and the Romans. And of course, the use of the Greek language is really highly an appeal to snobbery. We have that also on this gem, also shown to you by Rachel Patt, the fullest exposition of the Diomedes myth, because you have not only Diomedes and the Palladion and the statue and the dead body. On the left, you have Odysseus remonstrating with Diomedes for having committed this sacrilege in front of the walls of Troy. But above, we have in Greek letters the name, presumably of the owner, in Greek, transliterated. It's Calpurnius Severos, and those of you who know Greek can see the work to spell Severos in Greek. And then the carver's name is down on the altar, Felix. It's called, as Rachel said, the Felix gem. And Felix, as we saw on Apollonides Felix, means lucky or happy. And it's essentially a slave name. You know, no good Roman is named Felix. People today are named Felix. It's a perfectly worthwhile name today, but it's a slave name. And we don't really know about this Felix. We don't know if he was a slave. He might have been a freedman. Slavery in the ancient world was rather different than slavery we're more familiar with on this side of the Atlantic. There were horrible jobs, terrible conditions for slaves, and also in the ancient world, we'll talk about a bit, but slaves were also university professors and imperial bureaucrats and skilled craftsmen, and they could and often did obtain their freedom. And for example, not a gem engraver, but a Faber Argentarius, a silversmith. This is the marble tombstone of a man named Publius Cortilius Agato, who is a Greek, but that PL in the middle of his name means Publi Libertus, the freedman of Publius. So he earned his freedom, was granted his freedom, bought his freedom, we don't know, as a silversmith. Presumably he had access to precious metals and wealth. He's shown with the tools of his trade, a hammer that's broken, an engraver. He's got a bowl with a plug in it that even has a dancing satyr, like the one in the exhibition, the beautiful green gem. And he's also wearing a ring and a toga. So it's showing his status. He's a freedman who, he's a craftsman, an enslaved craftsman who was able to gain his freedom. And when we come to gem engravers, I don't have a picture of this epitaph, but it's from the Sacred Way, as you can kind of see underneath the captioning here, De Sacra Via. They're all Gemari, but there is a Felix, a Quintus Plotinus, the freedman of Quintus, as well as Plotius Anteros, Plotius Nicator, Babius Regulus, and Babia Asia, a woman. And these are all freed slaves. This is the L in all of these names. And they all worked on the Sacred Way in the Roman Forum in Rome's jewelry district. And that name, Babia Asia, at the top, may reflect the origins of Babia from, again, what we call Asia Minor or Turkey. So these people had different statuses, but they could make good, they could achieve their freedom by achieving some degree of wealth through their skills. So let me just check the time. Okay. So I want to jump now from the engravers sort of at the end of the production chain way back to the beginning of the production chain. This map is one of many produced by Lisbeth Thorson, who gave a wonderful lecture here recently, and I'm grateful for Lisbeth, not only for providing me with some of the images I'm going to show you today, but also her really generous sharing of her knowledge, which I know Ruth has also benefited from in the exhibition. These are the sources of gemstones throughout the ancient world. And the process of mining and extracting gemstones was not an easy one. And I can only show you photographs of modern day gem mining, for example, in Sri Lanka, but also in other places, including in the New World. We have hints of this in ancient literature. Rachel Pat read to you some passages from the Lithica of Posidippus, these courtly poems of the Hellenistic period. And Posidippus writes more than once of stones that are washed down from mountains and torrents from Arabia or from India. And sometimes gemstones could be plucked, from riverbeds, and that's easy. But often they had to be extracted from mines. And the ancient mines about which we have the most information are from Egypt. And Lisbeth talked about these, and I'm going to talk about some of the same places, but from a slightly different angle. And I'll be looking at 3 sites, the emerald mines at Sikiat, the amethyst mines at Wadi al-Hudi, and the peridote mines on St. John's or Zabgarad Island. And of course, the Egyptian desert was very mineral rich. There were also gold mines there. There are turquoise mines in the Sinai. And some of these sites had been exploited since pharaonic times, and they continued to be exploited in the Greek and Roman period. So this is just a reminder. And even in pharaonic times, there was also overseas trade. The lapis lazuli is always coming from Afghanistan until it started coming from Brazil. So if we start looking at Sikiat in the Eastern Desert, this is one of the sources of emeralds, smaragdoi to the Greeks and smaragdi to the Romans. This area was known to the Romans as Mons Smaragdus, Emerald Mountain. But there isn't a mountain. There are these hills and wadis, and there are multiple mines scattered throughout. But there was like this mythical El Dorado, the Emerald Mountain. And these have been explored, and there are massive settlements with rock-cut buildings. This Lisbeth showed you this slide of a temple at Sikiat. Here's a plan. We have the temple down here in red. You also had other buildings that are thought to be administrative. The 6-window building, we don't know, lots of settlements. And then there are, pits and shafts cut into the rock, going deeper and deeper, following the veins of quartz in which emeralds would be found. And here's a view of the entrance to one of these mines, the galleries within the mines. And these wouldn't have been fun places to work. Here you see the wonderful preservation, what Egypt preserves that the Greco-Roman, the Mediterranean world doesn't, such as baskets. And the excavators there, the explorers, these images all come from a team from the University of Barcelona, which have been excavating recently. You even see an inscription in the rock in the lower right that says Loc 6, as in locus 6, place, as these things are being monitored. And explorers to this day have found scraps, of offcuts of abandoned material. Similarly, inland south of Aswan is the site of Wadi al-Hudi, which seems to be the major source of amethyst for both the Egyptian pharaonic period and the Greco-Roman period. And a team led by Kate Liska of the University of California State University at San Bernardino has been working on this material, and again has generously shared with me some of her images, not the amethyst gem, which is in the exhibition, but these sites. And here they've identified over 45 separate mining sites. So this area was very heavily exploited, first under the pharaohs and then under the Greeks and Romans. And there are many of these sites. And again, now it's dry, there's scree, but in the lower left, you can see, some of the the crystals that are still in the rock where they've been carved away and exploited by the miners. Here you can see how there are settlements, there are mines, but there are also all these outposts, all these surveillance points. And there's a question, what did these serve for? Did these serve to protect the mines from marauders, or did these serve as a kind of surveillance regime to surveil those mining to keep safe the precious gemstones, to keep things from being stolen or exported? And you can see that there are walls, there are very clear one-way traffic systems and guard posts in these places. This is Site 9. This is a massive pharaonic fortress that was re-inhabited by the Greeks and Romans. There is a huge mine in the center here to the right of the fortress. You see walls, and in the lower left of the plan, you can see these small rooms that seem to be the treasures where things would be stored. This is another view of that same area. So you can see how much mining there was. And in addition to small chips of amethyst, they found a lot of stone pounders that would be used to extract the amethyst from the core material. And here are just some of the views of the surviving architecture, which has lasted for 2,000 years out in the desert, but is now sadly at risk as people have, Land Rovers and can go out there and exploit things. So it's great work that Kate Liska and her team and others are doing. We don't know much about the operation of these specific mines during the Greek and Roman period, but during the Pharaonic period we do. And this inscription gives us a sense of expeditions that were sent out from the capital with 1,000 strong arms. These were the laborers, but also you have fighters, guards, and soldiers. 200 from Elephantine, 100 from Kamombo. Then you have chiefs of the miners, what we might call the engineers, the prospectors, the skilled labor, administrators, overseers of the strongmen, more troops. For this one exhibition, way before our period, from around 1955 BC, over 1,500 people out there. And you have to imagine the other people involved. People to bring water, people to bring food, people to move animals. This was major expeditions. And there is here a lot, I think, of discussion as to whether or not these people were free or enslaved. Clearly, chiefs of miners, the skilled engineers, administrators probably, had some status, but 1,000 strong arms, we don't know. From our period, from the Hellenistic period, we have literary evidence of what went on in the gold mines nearby. And I want to read you here a passage from Agatharchides of Knidos, who in the late 2nd century wrote about the really harrowing conditions at the Ptolemaic gold mines in the Egyptian desert. Agatharchides writes, "Much gold is collected with great suffering and expense. As for those who have been overwhelmed by extreme misfortune, these people the tyrannical government condemns to the bitterest slavery, that of the gold mines. Some suffer together with their wives and children, some apart from them. The kings of Egypt," these are the Ptolemies, "collect together and consign to the gold mines those condemned for crimes and prisoners of war. In addition, those who have been the victims of unjust accusations and sent to prison because of their wrath, sometimes themselves alone, sometimes together with their whole families. Those convicts who are numerous and bound with fetters work their tasks continuously during the day and throughout the whole night, being allowed no respite at all, and rigorously prevented from the possibility of escape. For barbarian soldiers who speak different languages are appointed to be guards, so that the prisoners cannot corrupt any of their warders through conversation or some humane appeal." Yeah. Our third site, which Lisbeth mentioned briefly, we know more about, is St. John Island. And again, it's this one, oops, down here in the Red Sea. And it was the source of peridot, known as topazos in Greek, which isn't topaz, although it's the source of our word topaz, causing confusion. And Lisbeth talked about this stone. Ruth talks about it in the catalog. It's kind of bottle green, the color of leeks, according to ancient sources. And this windswept island was exploited by the Ptolemies, and there are both ancient mines as well as modern mines on the site. And these photographs taken by James Harrell show you again how desolate the environment is. And Agatharches also described the very hard life of those stationed here. So the previous quote was for gold miners. This is about the peridot miners on this island. First of all, he mentions the efforts of the Ptolemaic kings to rid it of all kinds of fearful snakes. And the Greek name of this island is Ophiades, which means snaky island. So, you know, you're there with snakes. And what Agatharches says is, the island is kept closed to visitors, and any person who lands on it is put to death by the guards stationed there. See, here's another view. These guards, who are a few in number, lead a wretched life. For in order to prevent any stone from being stolen, not a single boat is left on the island. Those sailing by do so at a distance because of fear of the king. The supplies that are imported are quickly consumed, and the other sources of native food to the island are wholly lacking. Consequently, whenever there are a few provisions left, the people all sit around the village awaiting the arrival of the ship to bring their supplies. Whenever these are delayed, however, they are reduced to despair. So once the peridot or the emeralds or the amethysts or any other stones were extracted, they had to be worked and shaped. This could be done in the quarries, or it could be done elsewhere. Here is a peridot, I think Lisbeth showed you this, found at Berenike on the port on the mainland of Egypt that came and was found there. We also have from India, we have examples of uncarved cameo blanks that were eventually transshipped to the Mediterranean world. We also know that at one stage, but we don't know when, stones were often enhanced. And this could be done, and Rachel Patt spoke about this eloquently. It could be done by heating, by dipping in honey, by changing the color. And this is done to this day, the color enhancement of gemstones. But again, if we want to see what the life of miners was like, we have to leave India, Sri Lanka, or Egypt, and we go to Spain, where we have some reliefs showing miners, again, gold miners from Linares, from the great Rio Tinto region, where teams worked for centuries in the mines. And here you see on the far left an overseer with a kind of, I don't know, what do you call tongs, as well as miners wearing aprons and carrying pickaxes. Some of these people were certainly enslaved from the mines. Fetters, ankle irons have been found, so not a pleasant life. Agatharchides mentions in the Egyptian mines, people there condemned with their wives and children. And of course, in these narrow tunnels and cavities, children would be especially apt to enter. And again, from Spain, we have this gravestone of a child, either Quartulus or Quintus Archulus, who, depending on how you read the inscription, died at age 4, or more likely age 9. And you can see in his right hand, he has a basket, and his left hand, he has a kind of pickaxe. This boy probably isn't a poor, struggling miner who died in the quarries. This tombstone is my height. It's a massive piece of stone. It's a very expensive monument. It's likely that Quartulus was the son and heir of a mine operator, being depicted as often on Roman tombstones as an adult, as the adult he would have become, rather than as the child. But it does certainly seem that children were active in the mines. The stones, as I said, as they came out of the mines, they might be finished or they might be transported, or partially finished, might be transported raw. This was done through a variety of trade routes using the monsoon winds. One of the key trade routes was to sail around the Arabian Gulf and then go up, either up through the desert, and both routes often led to Palmyra, which became incredibly wealthy, dominating not only overseas trade through caravans, such as you see in the upper left, but also by dominating the seaborne trade. As you don't often think of Palmyra, queen of the desert, as operating a maritime empire, but we have good evidence in inscriptions as well as reliefs. And then I show you one of many Palmyran reliefs showing women bedecked with jewelry, gold, but also gemstones. This relief has lots of lost inlays, maybe actually for colored glass rather than gemstones, but again, showing the great wealth that could be acquired. Again, at different points along the journey, jewelers came into play. And here you see this romanticized view from the house of the Veti of Pompeii of Cupids and Psyche as jewelers working gold on the anvil, weighing things out for a customer, seemingly setting something in stone, working with a blowpipe in an oven, and hammering a shield. And we have, again, inscriptions for gold workers, some of whom were imperial freed people from the household of Tiberius, from the household of the Empress Livia. We have a very poignant funerary inscription of a boy named Pagus, who was enslaved, who died as a grief to both his parents, presumably, who were also enslaved, and his master, who was praised for his skill of fitting gems to beautiful gold settings. So I show you this ring in the exhibition with its wonderfully shaped band that you can just imagine. Maybe Ruth, you got to put it on and to actually feel the beauty of this gold. And of course, an aurifex, of which there are many references to aurifices in Roman literature and tombstones. They'd also make pendants and brooches that could themselves be set with stones like these two in the exhibition, as well as earrings in this pair with emeralds hanging from it. And I want to show you the backside so you get a sense of the technique involved. This is where, maybe some of the work of Babia Asia and Babius Regulus and Plotinus Nicator and others were working as jewelers, putting the jewels in their settings along the sacred way. And we have, again, other tombstones, such as the one on the left of an aurifex on the Via Sacra. And on the right is a statue base for a Margaritarius, a pearl merchant who earned so much money that he could have a statue erected of himself. These people all operated, as I said, along the sacred way in Rome, in the Roman Forum. Many of you, I'm sure, have trod these paths along the Forum. And what you see are these little small rooms that have been variously identified as prison cells or as brothels, because they're very small, dark rooms, but they've recently, very plausibly to my mind, been reinterpreted as the jewelry district, where you want secure things, thick walls, closed banks, where the jeweler's quarter was. Of course, gemstones were also set in a variety of other objects, gem-studded bowls. They were applied to architecture, luxury architecture, Some of this is glass, but it's also peridot, rock crystal, sapphire, and beryls. This is from the Horti Lamiani in Rome, the home of a high-powered senator. Even military helmets, although the gems in this helmet found in Serbia are made of glass. So they're imitation gems, but it gives you the sense of the bling involved and the different crafts involved. We haven't had time, and we don't have time, and I won't talk about glass gems. Here are 4 in our collection. There are several in the exhibition, and even ancient literature talks about shoes and sandals that were gem-studded. I can't show you slides of any ancient gem-studded shoes, but I was in Venice last summer, and Dolce & Gabbana released a new line of faux gems on their sandals. So with that, I close, but this final slide gives you a sense of the numbers of people involved in the trade. And I think this is very incomplete. I don't have basket weavers and rope makers and others, but you could see at each stage, many, many people beyond the engravers whose work we rightly celebrate gave their skill, their labor, their time to efforts to bringing these gems to the market. And of course, the order of some of these things could be mix and match. And there are probably many merchants and transshipments and middlemen involved. It's not a straight linear move from the mines to the shops, to the owners who are off the screen, but we'd probably be bouncing back and forth. So with that, I thank you. I thank the Laszlos, I thank Elizabeth, I thank Ruth especially, and I'm happy to try to entertain any questions you might have.
Since I have the mic, I get to ask the first question.
Okay, Elizabeth.
What is the evidence that's been put forward to say that these places in the forum might be jewelry stalls? I love that idea.
Well, you have all the inscriptions about there being jewelers along the sacred way. So they were there somewhere, right? And so it's what spaces are plausibly theirs. And so looking for those spots, there are these structures that seem to be very, very high security, small, that could be closed and locked with shutters, which is why, one, they were sometimes identified as prisons, but we don't know if prisoners being kept right in the middle of the forum, at least in the imperial period. And the other is, they've been thought to be brothels because they're small rooms, and they're kind of benches in them that you could put a jeweler's cabinet and have counters on. So it's kind of through analogy, but really the inscriptions tell us, if not these spaces, something nearby. And there's also evidence that after the fire of Rome, things shifted around, and some of the jewelers were shifted out of the forum to somewhere else, and some of these spaces go out of operation at that time. So that's another argument. As far as I know, there aren't inscriptions, on the wall saying this is the jewelry shop of Plotius Babus, which would really be the conclusive thing. But I think the circumstantial evidence is very strong.
Dr. Laszlo, you had a question.
Well, thank you so much, Ken, for that beautiful presentation. As we look at these marvelous gems in the exhibit, we are astounded at the artisans who have the vision and the skill to do this. Were there schools to train such people?
I don't think there were schools. There were apprenticeships. Sons would apprentice with fathers. Aside from Babia Asia, there isn't evidence for female gem engravers in the ancient period. There is evidence on inscriptions for female goldsmiths. And Ruth, you may be able to correct me here. And I know there's evidence in the Renaissance and later for female gem engravers who learned the craft from their fathers. One question I think it was asked of Rachel is, did they have magnification? And this has been debated, and the evidence seems to indicate not, but myopia, which actually has magnificatory properties, is a genetic condition that could also be passed down, through generations. I, many years ago, commissioned an engraved gem from a workshop in England. And the carvers boasted that they were the largest gem engraving workshop in England. There were two of them, father and son, right? So this seems to be the apprenticeship. We have some documents from Mesopotamia about the rations given to gem engravers. And we know also that from one of those documents that an apprenticeship was 5 years in ancient Mesopotamia. But a school implies to me something larger and more organized. Presumably an apprentice would start using grinders and shaping a stone, like maybe Pythagoras doing things for his father before he went off and became a mathematician. And then, presumably Dioscorides' 3 sons, or Quintus, the son of Alexis, started off working with and for their father before graduating to more and more complex work. Yeah.
Are there other questions in the room? If not, I'll go to Zoom. Okay.
One of the requirements to be a gemstone is that it's hard. I mean, a hardness of 7 or more for
Right.
it, so that it'll take a polish. So the ability to carve a very hard stone with the tools that they had available at the time, not the ones that Shevdar uses, where he uses diamond tools and very stable lathes and drills. They didn't have that back then. And when I look at the tools, the bow drill that you showed, it seems to be huge compared to the little tiny gemstone that are carving, and very unstable tools. They must vibrate a lot. And so it doesn't seem that the technology that they use was able to produce a gemstone like that amethyst you see in them.
Okay, I'll admit it was space aliens.
Thank
Truth
you,
is
guys.
out. Yeah, no, you're right. It's extraordinary. It's extraordinary. And on the original of this, those letters, they're less than 1 millimeter tall. But of course, it's not the tools that cut the gem, and Chavdar will talk about this. It's the abrasive that the tools carry. But what that means is that the tools are worn down and have to constantly be refashioned. So the engravers either have to acquire their tools, I say tool makers there in the bottom of the middle column, but Chavdar and others presumably made their own tools and were constantly remaking them. The vibration's a very good point, and yet they clearly mastered that. On this miniature scale, they could get incredible detail, which they didn't necessarily have to see. They could feel, stop, clean, make an impression, look, say, okay, I need to go further there, and do it by feel, in part because the material is so hard, it would take time. Time is something we feel we have little of and we value very highly. The ancients had more time, right? And of course, the more skilled you are, the easier it comes with repetition. Yeah, but it is quite remarkable what they did with the technology. And apart from electricity or diamonds versus a bow drive and corundum, which is 9 rather than 10 on the Mohs scale, you can do a lot. The other thing Chavdar told me is that you really don't want super high speeds. That doesn't help you. And in fact, it could hurt you because it throws your abrasive slurry off the tool and you can lose control. So with the bow drill, you can really adjust the speed. And Chavdar, I think in the video, talks about going back and forth. But there are ways of using a bow drill where you get continuous rotation. You pull and then you slack and you go up and then you pull. So you can have single rotation, which would, I think, mitigate that vibration problem, which a reversing tool would bring.
Let me check and see if there are any
Okay,
questions.
there's one in the back. Well, you want
Let's
to check
see.
first. All right. I don't know if you need to escape out. Yeah.
Oh, this bit is here.
Hi, Lisbeth. Thank you so much.
She asks, she says, the finished trapezoidal peridot cabochon found at Berenike is identical to some of the peridot cabochons found at the Horti
Lamiani?
Berenike functioned as the processing center for peridot. Do you think these gems might have been fashioned at Berenike and were then transported to Rome, or is the explanation about where the peridots fashioned more complex?
Thank you, Elizabeth. I think it's perfectly plausible that they were, brought raw from the island of Berenike, worked there, and shipped on. Although we know there are Roman carved gems that are clearly Roman that are found in the Indian ports. Does that mean there were Roman carvers in India, or does it mean things were reverse shipped and there was trade going both ways? Both are possible, but I think for the peridot, the most economical, meaning efficient, if not less expensive, explanation is the one you propose, that Berenike is a processing point for things moving on. That would also, not that even the raw stones are so heavy, it would make them lighter, but you could also determine quality. You could separate different grades of quality and maybe sell them for more in a finished state than you would in a raw state. But yeah, I think you're right. Thank you, Elizabeth.
And who else, who had a question?
I'm kind of like you. I was interested in the jewelry stalls. It's like a, ancient West 47th Street. Do we have any way of knowing how much people would have paid back then for these gemstones?
We have a few prices, but they're kind of scattered references in ancient literature. One of my favorite stories is told by Pliny the Elder, who's a great source of all kinds of gemological information, both trustworthy and not, and some of which he doubts himself, but he says, I'll tell you this anyway, although I don't believe it. He tells a story of an ancient Greek musician of the 4th century who was very famous, like a rock star of his day, Ismenias, who was like Liberace, who collected gems and liked to show off his gems and his wealth. And he hears about this amazing gem on Cyprus. So he sends agents to go buy it. And they come back and they say, look, when we told them that we were your agent, they gave us a discount. And Ismenias is furious with them because by paying less, he felt they lessened the value of his acquisition. And that was 4 gold coins. But this is Pliny in the 1st century AD relaying a story he's heard of something that happened in the 4th century BC. So what this monetary value isn't. We have gems also listed in the classical period inventories of the Athenian Acropolis and other temples. And what's interesting is that they're generally rated by weight. But when you carve them, you reduce their weight, right? But somehow you're adding value. So again, what the prices are, we have these odd tidbits. Somebody else says that, the gem sold for, a drachma or an aureus or a coin, but we don't know what those gems were. Ruth, do you have further thoughts on this topic? Because I think you've probably looked at that more than I have in some ways.
There is a reference, and I can't remember what it is or where it is, but that suggests that, the carved stones clearly are more expensive than the uncut. But I think sort of based on comparisons where we sort of know of a system for the pricing of gold and other precious materials, we can sort of deduce, as gems are valued today, it's sort of based on weight, clarity,
Color,
quality, the other kind of desirable features, but weight seems the most likely.
yeah.
But what that was, we don't know.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
Lisa.
Thank you, Ken. I was wondering, I was really taken by your story about Pythagoras and thinking about gems in antiquity versus gems today and how we facet cut them.
Mhm.
And so having looked at enough gems, they get a really sharp edge with the bezels, but they don't facet cut them. Is that because, do you think, the like crystalline nature of the minerals, or, and how are rubies and sapphires different in that they would be, at some point in the modern era, they're facet cut instead of engraved?
I mean, this is why I showed you these octagonal jaspers from Asia Minor in the 2nd century, because they're the best examples from facet cutting, but they post-date Pythagoras by half a millennium. So I'm kind of pushing it there, but I don't think it's the best analogy is rubies or sapphires, because although there's some good evidence for sapphires and less good evidence for rubies in reaching the classical world, I think our better evidence is emeralds that come in, in number in the Hellenistic period, and even earlier rock crystal, right? And these are all, well, emeralds, rubies, sapphires are precious, but most of the other gems in the show, we call semi-precious today. But what they're doing, say, with emeralds in necklaces, is they're using the natural faceted structure, except when they're not, when they're carving them and they make beads. And most fascinating to me are a whole series of miniature, and I'm sorry I don't have slides of them because I wasn't prepared for your question, but I'm grateful for it, of small rock crystal perfume vessels, many of which are faceted, some of which are faceted, recutting the facets of the rock crystal itself. And the most extraordinary ones are the ones that deny the crystalline structure and go for round, oval shapes and elongated shapes, which are exquisite. The Metropolitan has a few on loan. I don't know the lucky person who owns them. So there was this, I think, desire both to exploit the faceted nature of some gemstone materials, but also to overcome that and virtuosically get around it. That's more of a comment on your question than an answer, but yeah, whether Pythagoras was inspired by his father being a gem engraver or not, I don't know. It sounds good, doesn't it? It sounds good, yeah.
Ken, thank you so much. And thank you to Dr. and Mrs. Laszlo for making this possible. And Ruth, thank you for the beautiful exhibition that occasioned it. So
Yeah.
thank you all for coming. And I will just say that Shavdar will be here on starting November 8th. So please check the calendar. He'll be doing a conversation with Ruth. He'll be doing a workshop where you can sign up. And I will tell you, I bought the supplies for that. So he still needs a lot of tools. Lots of the little.
He uses a lot of tools. That gem I had commissioned in England, the carvers looked at, it was a replica of a Bronze Age gem in the Ashmolean Museum, and I was able to get an impression as well as photographs of that gem from the Ashmolean. And those carvers said, oh, for us to carve this, we'd use a dozen tools, but we think it was carved with just 4. So we're going to try to do it with 4. So Shavdar doesn't need as many tools as he uses. It's helpful to him.
Bought a lot of those, the little things that go on the end, the actual.
Well, I guess since you bought them, you've got them. So
All right.
thank you very much.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.